This is a reprise of sessions from prior Living to 100 symposia, where we have representatives from multiple countries presenting their views on their national trends and what they've seen, particularly from a social insurance, social security perspective. I'm really pleased to have 3 panel members, the first from the United Kingdom, the second from Canada, and the third from the United States. I'm going to be giving about a minute introduction, and then we'll have the 3 speakers present, and hopefully we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end if I do my moderator's duty correctly and the speakers behave. That we will have 10, 15 minutes to have some Q&As afterwards, so prepare your questions. First, Adrian Gallop is a consultant to the Government Actuaries, or from the Government Actuaries Department in London. Will be giving the first presentation. The second one will be given by Assia Billig, who's the relatively new Chief Actuary of OSFI, the Canada Pension Plan. And last, but certainly not least, would be Steve Goss, who's the Chief Actuary of the U.S. Social Security Administration. I'm looking forward to this panel, so therefore let's start with Adrian.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Sam, and thank you for the invitation to speak here again. It's especially pleasing to be speaking at the Living to 100 Symposium this year because the Government Actuaries Department actually reached its 100th birthday last year in 1919. So in this presentation, I'm just going to talk a bit about the latest population projections, the 2018-based population projections in the UK, give a few slides showing historical trends. Is that better? Yeah, okay, yeah. So I have to bend over a bit. Okay. A few slides showing historical trends, and then at the end, if I get time, a couple of slides on mortality by deprivation, socio-economic category, and insured and retired. So the population projections in the UK are done normally every 2 years. So the latest ones, the 2018, were issued in October last year. And these just shows some highlights from the period life expectancies. You can see about 2053, we had a period life expectancy of 83.8 years, so it's about 1 year lower than we were projecting for the same year in the previous population projections. Similarly for females, both at birth and at age 65. So there's been a kind of about a year's reduction over the long term in the latest projections. So I'm just going very quickly through the method for setting the mortality assumptions. So basically we estimate mortality improvements for 2017-18 by age and gender. We then set target rates for the 25th year of the projections, as in this case 2043. We make various assumptions about how we get from where we think we are now to where we think we're going to be in 25 years' time, and also what is going to happen after the 25th year in the projections. So we then get a 2-by-2 table of mortality improvements, which we then apply to the assumed base mortality rates for 2018. This we do for the UK as a whole to start off with, and then we then adjust those projections for each individual constituency country in the UK, so that's Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and then these are all aggregated back up again to get final projections for the UK. And then finally there's an adjustment made to the deaths in 2018-19 from what we were projecting for those deaths to what we know about the actual numbers of deaths in 2018-19. The data we use for setting the projections is from 1961 to 2017. We take the numbers of deaths and the population estimates for those years, and we produce smooth mortality rates for that period. But rather than using the improvement rates for 2016-17 you get from that process, we step back and we use the improvement rates for 2014-15. This is basically because when you add an extra year's worth of data to the database, you can get quite different edge effects. But stepping back 3 years is a bit more stable when you add on some extra years' data. We then roll those forward, so by age for those born 1960 and later, and by cohort for those born in 1960 and before. So I'll just go through that one. So this is just a graph of how we get forward. And then once we get to 2019, similarly, we carry on those assumptions in the short term, again by age for the younger people and by cohort for the older people. And then over time, these will merge to the assumed long-term rates of improvement. And then, as I said, we then disaggregate the data down to each individual country. So the next few slides, just looking at recent and historic trends in mortality in the UK. Many of you will have seen these graphs before, I think, but for life expectancy at birth in England and Wales, there was basically small increases over the 19th century. And then from the beginning of the 20th century, there was quite rapid increases as mortality improvements were for infants and then for young adults and then middle-aged adults. And from 1950 onwards, there's been a continuing increase, but not at as fast a rate as in the first half of the 20th century. But then from 2011 onwards, as those of you who were at the talk yesterday that I gave will have seen that in the UK, that life expectancy has not risen very much since 2011. This is showing the same thing, but for period life expectancy at age 65, so there's kind of similar patterns, but life expectancy at these ages didn't really start increasing until about the 1930s for females, and for males around about the 1970s. This is partly due to things like differentials in smoking and types of work and so on, but males have now been catching up with females in more recent years. These next two graphs just show mortality improvements. So the age thing is very small, but the light blue block is for age 20 to 39, and then 40 to 59, and then 60 to 79, and the light green is 80 to 99. So it's just showing the patterns that in the early years of the 20th century, it was the mortality improvements were greatest at the youngest stages, and then as we've moved through time, the larger improvements were at the middle ages, and then the yellow ages in the 60 to 79 one. But from 2011 onwards, as I said, there's been relatively little improvement in mortality rates in the UK at any of these ages. And again, this is a similar pattern for females. So again, a very similar pattern of high improvements for young ages first and then moving up through the age over time. So looking at age-standardised mortality rates, so this just looks at age-specific mortality rates standardised by the European Standard Population. And here you can see that from 2001 to 2011, for both males and females, this fell in a relatively straight line. You can fit a regression line to that, and it's a very, very good fit. But again, from 2011 onwards, there's been much slowdown in mortality improvements in the UK. And this has affected successive population projections, as I'll show in a few slides later on. One of the purposes of this thing is that we ask experts, a group of experts about their opinions about what will happen to mortality rates in the future, and some of the things we discuss are things like cause of death, and these next two graphs just show the age-standardised mortality rates for the top 5 leading causes of death from 2001 to 2017 in England and Wales. So you can see there's been a continuing decrease in deaths from ischemic heart disease. For diseases, cerebrovascular disease, cancers and chronic lower respiratory diseases, that's been relatively flat. The thing that has been increasing is deaths from dementia and Alzheimer's. You can see it particularly even more for females. This is the kind of the mid-blue line, which is gradually increasing as you move to the right-hand side of the graph. Now, this may not be entirely due to increases in deaths from Alzheimer's and dementia, because there have been incentives in the UK recently for doctors to prescribe, to diagnose Alzheimer's and dementias when they're doing the diagnosis, and also to write that on the death certificate. So it's much more accepting to write down Alzheimer's and dementias on death certificates now than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. So it may well be that some of this, in the early years, that people were dying from Alzheimer's or dementia, but it was being coded as respiratory disease death or heart disease. Then just another thing that we show to the experts is kind of the increases in obesity in England. So again, that was increasing in the earlier part of the late 1990s and early 2000s, but has kind of been relatively flat more recently. So moving on to the actual assumptions in the latest population projections. So our kind of long-term improvement rate assumption is 1.2% by age for both males and females up to age 90, and then reducing down to 0% for over the age range from 90 to 110. And that once you reach 2043, you're assumed to take that 1.2% with you as you age through time until you reach age 90, and then that will then go down to 0% as you move through to 110 and older. So these are broadly the same assumptions as we used in the 2016 base projections up to age 90, but we've reduced the assumptions at older stages. In the previous projections, we assumed 1.2% at all ages. However, there are different short-term assumptions in these projections compared to the previous projections. So in choosing the target rate of 1.2%, it's kind of the rates of improvement at the early stages that are most important. The mortality rates at young ages are very low in the UK, and kind of what you assume about those, it has very little effect on the projections unless we had a very large decrease in the assumed improvements. Looking historically over a long period of time, since 1911, the average increase in age-standardised mortality rates over the age range 0 to 99 has been about 1.2% per annum. So we're kind of keeping that trend there. So we also have this expert panel, and we asked for their views, and I'll do that in the next slide. A bit later on also I'll show that previously people who were born in the 1920s and 1930s in the UK had very high rates of improvement compared to those born either side. This now appears to have disappeared, so we now no longer have an adjustment at the older stages to allow for higher improvements at those ages. And again, as we've seen in various sessions earlier in this conference, there's a big debate about whether future technical, medical and environmental changes will have a bigger or lesser impact in the future than in the past. So this is just a summary of some of the views of the expert panel. So although we've seen relatively small improvements in the UK mortality since 2011, the experts argue that we shouldn't be unduly influenced by this at present. We need to see a kind of a longer trend, and we've seen kind of periods where there's been slowing down and increases in the past. There's discussion about smoking. Smoking prevalence in the UK is now very low. Only about 16% of adults in the UK smoke, so there's a debate about whether there would be any future gains from smoking, whether we've had the gains from that now. There was discussion about whether obesity how that would impact mortality, but there was some experts think it would have a big impact on mortality. There's relatively little impact on mortality. It will affect morbidity, but have much less effect on mortality. We've already, as I mentioned before, there's the increase in deaths from Alzheimer's and dementia, but again, that was discussed as being maybe a reporting issue. We also asked them about what they think their long-term rate, what they would assume long-term rates for, and averaging over the group of experts, they said 1.7% for ages up to 20, then reducing down to 1% for ages 80 and over. So as well as producing the principal population projection, we also produce a high life expectancy variant. In this case, is the target rate plus 0.7%, so that would be 1.9% at most ages. And the low life expectancy, where the target rate is 1.2% minus 1.2%, so it's basically 0% once you reach 2043 for all ages. These are kind of asymmetric, but these were based on, we asked the experts for their assumptions of what period life expectancy would be in 25 years' time, and also to give a confidence in a 67% confidence interval. And these are the kind of target rates that if you put those in our model will give you the period life expectancies at either end of the confidence intervals that the experts were suggesting. So this graph shows the solid lines here showing our assumed improvement rates. So the blue line is the improvement rates for males in 2018, and the yellow line, gold line, for females in 2018. And then the solid line, that kind of the 1.2% and going down to 0% is what we're assuming in the long term. And then the two dotted lines are the high and the low life variance assumptions for the high and the low life variance. So you can see that the 1.2% is actually broadly about what the improvement rates are for males between age about 50 and 85, and females of a similar age range. So these next two slides just trying to show the pattern of improvements in mortality by age, so the historical ones and what we're projecting in the future. So one of the colours on here, if you just along the x-axis is the year and the y-axis is the age, and the colour that you get at that intercept is the rate of improvement, the mortality rate at that age in that year, the improvement on that one compared to the mortality rate at that age in the previous year. So here you can see on the left-hand side, it's kind of the dark red area is what I was referring to earlier, where the people born in the 1920s and 1930s had very high rates of improvement compared to those born either side. But in the last kind of 10 years or so, that effect has disappeared. The areas of blue, are basically where, the dark blue, the mid-blue and the dark blue, are where mortality rates are actually worsening over time. So there's a patch in the kind of the 20s and 30s for males, which is due to deaths from AIDS and suicides and so on. Again, this is the same for females. So again, you can see again the cohort effects are not quite as strong for females as it was for males. But again, that's also petered out in more recent years. Oh, sorry, gone too far. So just to put the UK in context of other high-income developed countries. So in terms of current period life expectancies of birth for males, we're kind of on the countries here, we're lower than all the countries apart from those shown in red. So just Denmark, Germany, and the USA. And for females, we're only higher than Denmark. So kind of females are pretty low down in terms of developed countries. In terms of looking at what we're projecting for period life expectancy in 2060, again, we're still lower than so these are the latest projections for each of the national statistical offices. And so again, we're lower than most of these, apart from Germany and the USA and Australia. And also, if you look at kind of the gains that we're projecting compared to the gains for the countries, we're projecting now lower gains than most of these countries other than the USA, Australia, and Japan. Whereas kind of if you looked at something like the 2012 projections, we were much higher up in terms of the gains that we were projecting in life expectancy. So the main reasons why we're projecting lower life expectancy than in the previous projections is that you can see from this graph is that the top dotted blue line is the starting improvements that were assumed for 2017 to 2018 in the 2014 base projections. And the next dotted line down is what we're assuming for 2017-18 in the 2016 base projections, and then the solid blue line, what we're actually assuming in the current projections. So you can see in nearly all ages there's been a drop in the starting improvements. Okay. And again, similarly for females. It's also kind of a concomitant thing that arises from that is that the starting rates of mortality that we also assume for 2018 are higher at most ages than we were projecting for 2018 in the previous projections. So this slide just shows the projected period life expectancies at birth. The top two lines show 2010-2012 projections, then coming down successively to the solid line at the bottom, which is the 2018 projections. So since 2012, we're projecting successively less optimistic increases in life expectancy. So just now a few slides to finish with about mortality by region and deprivation. So there is a disparity of life expectancy by region in the UK and Scotland. So Scotland has the lowest life expectancy, and then in the southeast is the highest life expectancy. So the question of that, if we kind of take out, allow for differences in deprivation and so on in these areas, do we get no differences between regions or not? So these slides just showing life expectancy by IMD, so decile. So this is the index of multiple deprivations. This is an index that takes into account things like income, housing, education, a whole variety of things, and people are then allocated to one of 10 deciles. You can see from this one there's quite a gradient in life expectancy between those in the most deprived decile, which is 1 on this graph, and the least deprived decile. So the difference is about 9 years for males, and I think it's about 7 years for females. So another area of interest in the UK is kind of looking at healthy life expectancy. This is just showing the same graph again, but here the blue line shows of the whole life expectancy, how much of that is healthy life expectancy. Then the gold line is how much is years lived in poorer health. I think there's a word of caution on this one. This is based, I think, on self-reported ill health. So again, you can see as well as the gradient, there's also a similar gradient in years lived in poorer health, with the most deprived having higher unhealthy life expectancy than those in the least deprived decile. And also this is just showing how life expectancy by IMD has changed over time. You can see there's kind of quite a big gap between the two lowest, most deprived deciles and the other deciles, and there's the age gradient over all the deciles. And similarly for females. You can't really tell from that graph just what's been changed, but this graph shows that for male, the improvement in life expectancy by decile, so the left-hand side is, again, the most deprived decile, which is showing actually for females there's been a worsening in life expectancy between 2012-14 and 2015-17. And as you move across to the more to the least deprived decile, again you can see they've had the highest improvements in life expectancy over those 3 years. So next, just a couple of slides, just some work that's been done by the Actuarial Research Council in looking at again, changes in mortality by decile. So on the left-hand side, you've got this is age-standardised mortality rates for males aged 40 to 89. So again, you can see the spread between the most deprived decile, which is the top one, and the least one at the bottom. And then if you try and look at these the regions that I was showing earlier and allow for this deprivation, you can see that the difference is much smaller than it is by, if you're just looking at income deprivation. So if you look on the right-hand side, there is a slightly outlier that London appears to be an outlier to the other countries. That may be to do with things like immigration through London, kind of wealth aspects and so on. So that's something that they're looking into in more detail going forward. So this research is looking at a variety of things, in particular, what are the key drivers of all-cause mortality? How are the key drivers changing over time? What causes of death have high levels of inequality? Can we point to specific causes of death responsible for the growing inequality over time? And hopefully you'll be able to use this research for underwriting and pensions projections. So the kind of initial results from this research are that the causes of death listed here are ones that are leading to growing inequality, so that the ones in the most deprived areas are suffering more from these causes of death than those in the least deprived areas. And there was no significant cause of death which was causing inequality, causing the mortality to narrow. The main contributors to the slowdown since 2011 were heart disease, but less so for the least deprived, dementias and Alzheimer's, and possibly respiratory diseases, and possibly diabetes. Oh, sorry. So this is just a summation of that research. So basically, it seems to be that the causes of death which have associated controllable risk factors are leading to increased mortality inequality. That's particularly so for most of the big causes of death. There are still regional differences after you adjust the data for levels of deprivation. The causes of death with few controllable risk factors, there's little or no inequality between the least and the most deprived ones. And the mortality inequalities have widened since 2001. And slowdown is, as I said, the ones that were recorded apart from possibly ischemic heart disease, which has caused no slowdown in the least deprived groups. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's kind of very useful for us and very useful for our work. So I'd like to start by providing you a little bit of the context of our work. So the mandate of our office is to conduct the actuarial evaluations of a wide range of social security programs, as well as the federal public sector pension and insurance programs. So you can see approximately the ballpark numbers of the people that are exposed to our programs, and compare for US and UK, they seem to be quite a small numbers, but we are a small country. So, sorry? Yes, well, large country in territory, but small in population, exactly. Our office setup is quite interesting because you see, we have a lot of statutory obligations. So there are a lot of legislation that prescribe us to produce actuarial reports. And all actuarial reports that we produce, we are tabled in Parliament. So Adrian talked, for example, that they have a panel of experts that help them to determine the actuarial assumptions. This is not the case for us. while we do consult with the expert, this is ultimately responsibility of our office and myself personally as a chief actuary, as I sign all these reports. I'm personally responsible for all assumptions on which the results of the report are based. And in particular, it's true in the case because all our assumptions are best estimates. So we do not have any margin, any provisions for adverse deviation, and it's true for mortality as well. In some way, very lucky. We have access to very large amount of data. We have access to administrative data of the Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security Program. So it allows us to do our own analysis, and we develop mortality assumptions both for CPP, OS, as well for large federal public sector plans. Also, given the nature of our programs, our main focus is population 65 and over. So, as you can see, we do not have admin data on younger populations, so we use whatever is published as available publicly. So, this is why majority of my presentation today will be based on all the age group 65 and over, in consideration that how we develop our assumptions. So you saw already this slide for Adrian for UK, but here we compare like several countries: Canada, Japan, France, Finland, UK, and USA. So what you can see is approximately, like in 50s, US and Canada had higher life expectancy, better mortality than Japan and European countries. But then from mid-70s, situation is starting to change. Japan is catching up. And today we can see that the three countries, among the countries shown, of course, that have the highest life expectancy is Canada, Japan, and France. And this is for males. For female, situation is a little bit different. It was a constant mortality improvements from 1950s. And what is also interesting to see is that if for males, the Canada, France, and Japan had very similar life expectancy. Japan and France are quite ahead of Canada for females. But life expectancy is a very general number. So what we project, we do not project life expectancy. We project mortality rate by age and sex, and life expectancy is a result. So to develop our assumptions, we look at age groups. We look much more in details than just life expectancy. So these slides compare the mortality rates for all the age groups for 11 countries. And these are 11 countries with quite high longevity and population more than 8 million people. I don't want to really compare Canada to Monaco or Liechtenstein. I'm pretty sure they have much better mortality than we do. So if you look at the age group 65 to 74, I know it's pretty hard to see, but definitely Canada is in the middle of a pack, that there is quite a lot of space for us to improve our mortality in these age groups. When we move to the older age groups, and for example, if we look at 85 to 89, as you can see, the only two countries that they have lower mortality rates are France, which is the dark blue bars, and Japan, light blue bars. So, here, like we need really some medical breakthrough or changes in our lifestyle and underlying conditions to dramatically improve mortality rates. What is also interesting is to look at the causes of death, how Canada compares to the different causes of death. Here we have cancer, heart diseases, cerebrovascular diseases, and influenza and pneumonia. And red bar is Canada. Black bar is the country with the worst mortality among the countries that were shown in the previous slide, and green one with the best mortality. So, suspense. So for cancer, as you can see, UK has, for age group age 75-84, for both sexes, had worse mortality from cancer in 2015. Unfortunately, Canada is not very much behind. We share the second and third place with Switzerland. We look at diseases of the hearts. We're quite below Germany. And the only two countries that are better than us are Japan and France. The same is true with the stroke, and here it's only France that has lower mortality rates than Canada. You may ask me, why did I include influenza and pneumonia on the slide? And basically, this is to show you that even in Japan, where people seem to live forever, they're still mortal. Even if they don't die from cancer or heart diseases, they die from something else. As you can see, the death rate from influenza and pneumonia is much higher than in other countries. So, similar to UK, and probably you'll see later for US, a lot of the recent very strong improvement in life expectancy and in mortality in Canada were explained by decreasing mortality from heart diseases. It was improving at a rate of about 4% per year. But as you will see, you see the slope is changing. So recently we started to see the slowdown. It tells us that some kind of, I will not say very easy gain, but anyway, some gains that were there could be done, could be achieved, were achieved. Death from strokes are going down for males. From cancer also looks pretty good. Very nice to see that deaths from cancer, from lung cancer, and like basically cancer associated with smoking, are also going down for males. So here, basically, what we'll really try to hope to see more improvement from cancer, but we will see how it will. What will go on. For females, picture for heart diseases is very similar for stroke. When we look at the cancers, unfortunately, we don't see any notable improvements. It's becoming extremely stubborn, and the rates didn't really, like you see first they were still slightly increasing. Lately they were increasing by about 0.9% per year. What is interesting and they're quite sad is the increasing rate from the cancers related to smoking. It's probably related to the fact that there were heavy smoking cohort of women who started to smoke later. So hopefully we will see the similar developments in, like for men, that these rates will start down pretty quite soon. So we also have experienced the slowdown in mortality improvement in the recent years. If we look at the age group 65 and 69, dark blue line is males, light females. You can see we were, between 2003 and 2008, we were about 2.5 for males, 1.5 for females per year, mortality improvements. This is group 65-69. 2008, 2013, even better. Then comes 2013, 2018. Mortality improvement rates for males went down to 0. Actually, it's even slightly negative. And for females, it's 0.03. Very similar pictures for all the age groups, not to the same extent. So what we can really see, we see that there are some improvements, but it is still, like, mortality is improving, but at a slower pace as before. So as I said, when we develop our assumptions, we're solely responsible for our assumptions. So we do quite a lot of consulting, but at the end, it's up to us to justify our choice of mortality assumptions. And this I kind of give you an example of the factors we're looking at. And I already talked about the improvement in heart disease mortality and some of smoking for males. It may be quite hard to replicate, especially since the trends are pretty stable right now. There could be both, like, general favorable and unfavorable development in future mortalities, which are kind of quite hard to quantify, I'll tell you right away. But there's something which will probably be very specific to each country and which will depend on the economic and cultural development of countries. And basically talking about this, like, for example, we'll look at the Japanese females, a lot of kind of very specific diet. Yes, and then we compare them with the Canadian females. Do you think we can expect that Canadian females will live to the same advanced ages for as Japanese females without major changes in our lifestyle? so these are type of things that we're kind of looking at. So over the next few slides, I will look at the couple of some factors on obesity, opioids, income inequality, and marital status. So on obesity, Canada doesn't have anything to be proud of. We're considering 34 OECD countries, we are 29th. So, and trends in obesity have been stable. It's not really clear how it will impact mortality. Definitely will impact morbidity, type 2 diabetes, some cancers, cardiovascular diseases. What is shown on this slide is an exercise done by the OECD. What they do, they create like a synthetic population, and in this scenario, the alternative world where there is no obesity, and they compare life expectancy. So what we can see here, like by 2050 in Canada, where there's no obesity, the life expectancy would be about 3 years higher than in the world with the current level of obesities. Like, it's much more dramatic for USA, but as you can see, it's pretty small difference for Japan. Once again, talking about the difference in the lifestyle. Opioids. For us, it was very shocking, but between 2016 and 2017, the life expectancy at birth didn't go up. And we started later than US. Hopefully we'll not finish much later, but we will see. And this slide shows you the kind of contributions to the change in life expectancy between 16 and 17 for different provinces. So you see at the very, very bottom, for Canada as a whole, the males lost about 0.1 year of life between these 2 years just due to overdoses. And as you also can see, the main contributors are 2 provinces on the top, British Columbia and Alberta. These are western provinces, which are more exposed to the drug traffic and as well as the tainted drugs, fentanyl. So currently, governments are doing I have a lot of efforts. Like I have a pharmacy next to my work, and there is a big ad there that they distribute free Naxalone kits, that the drug that can prevent deaths from overdoses. So hopefully it will be a temporary effect. Definitely, as I said, since this is happening at the young ages, especially for males, it doesn't really affect our projection, but this is something that we keep an eye on. Mortality difference by socioeconomic level. Of course, the results of whatever you will show will depend how you measure inequality and level of granularity and so on. So here what I show you, which is relevant for us, for the Canada Pension Plan, it's the inequality by the level of pension. So, there are 2 things that interesting to see. First of all, that yes, there is inequality. Inequality, it's about at age 65 is about 2 years for at age 60 it's about 2.5 years for males and 2 years for females. So it definitely exists. Interesting thing is it diminishes by ages, and this is what we observe in other social security programs as well. What is also important for us, how stable is this inequality? Do we need to project, do we need to assume different improvement rates for different subpopulations? As you can see, the gap between highest and lowest pensions was quite stable for a while, so as a result, we do apply the same mortality improvement rates as a whole population, but as a base, we use different mortality table for the different level of pensions. This is quite an interesting slide. It's based on a different program. This is our demo grant. And it's a program it's a benefit which is paid to 97% of the Canadian population age 65 and over. And here what's shown is a difference by socioeconomic status. And here we measure it basically by are you eligible for the income tested benefit or not, and by marital status. And interestingly, marital status has much bigger impact, especially for males than for females. And I can tell you that based on this, the Single male at high low socioeconomic level is expected to live 1 year less than the married male at the low socioeconomic level. So please, guys, value us. Another subpopulation that we pay a lot of attention are survivors. As you can see, that the mortality of survivors is quite higher compared to the mortality of beneficiaries and general populations. Some of the reason could be grief effect, also loss of the financial security, social isolation, and so on. So this slide provides you the illustrations of the projected mortality improvement rates. The solid lines are the past improvements, smoothed, and the dotted lines are projected one. As you can see, this is for age group 65-74. We gradually produce the recent downward trend until in 2035, 20 years past projection, we reach our ultimate rate. And from age 0 to 89, we have ultimate mortality improvement of 0.8, and then we can gradually grade them down to 0. Once again, you can argue that it's probably not realistic for the younger ages to have the same ultimate mortality projections. Honestly, for this program, I don't really care. The rates are so low, so whatever I will do with ultimate mortality improvement rates, it will not change my results. It will not have impact on the sustainability, on the assessment of sustainability of Social Security. So this is a slide where I'd like to show you how our projections evolved over second consecutive actuarial report starting from 2000. And this is a cohort life expectancy for males at age 65. So you see, we're going up, 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 up. Then we, like between 2012 and 2009, we start to see some slowdown. We don't go up so fast. Even less in the next report, the most recent report, which was published a month ago. You see, we're actually starting lower in 2018 than we did when we were projecting in 2018. But still, we include quite a lot of future mortality improvements, and also you can see that from in 2019 we projected that male cohort life expectancy in 2000. We projected that in 2019, male cohort life expectancy will be around 18.3. In 2000, today, it's the second upper circle, we project it's about 3 years higher. And a very similar picture for females. So we do put a lot of work in developing mortality assumptions, but you can ask how important are they for the financial status of our plan. So this basically shows you that if we assume that ultimate mortality improvements will be twice at 0.8, so 1.6, the cost of the plan will go by 3%, so it will be 3% higher. Another, the red bar, what it shows, basically it shows what if the mortality, what if we will get stuck on today's level of mortality. And as a result, basically what it tells us that the current rate, the 7% of the current rate are just allowance for the future mortality improvements. And of course, I need to answer your question, can we live to 100? And you see, living to 100 was easy. 30 years ago, I took out a restraining order against the Grim Reaper. Not easy for us, and we tried to come up with, like I'm pretty sure my predecessor Jean-Claude showed you the same last time. We came up with 3 alternatives how we can achieve today the life expectancy of 100. So first alternative, let's take rate for every single age and reduce them by 86%. The second alternative, nobody dies below age 97, and then the current mortality rates apply. And the last one, for males, we extend lifespan from current assumed 120 to almost 140 years old, and we redistribute the mortality rate. So it's up to you to judge, can we live to 100 or not? And just to conclude, there is a lot of uncertainty related to future improvements. It's very important to understand the past, to analyze the past, but I think we really need to look into the future. We need to see how the world is changing and apply our best professional judgment trying to estimate future mortality. And the last point I would like to leave you with is we expect there will be future increases in older ages, especially at older ages. And we talk a lot about pension, but I think the programs that will be affected probably the most will be health systems, long-term care, and as an actuary, we should probably not forget about it. Thank you very much.
You always need a first-rate AV guy to get it going. Thanks, Sam. Well, thanks, SOA, and for the invite to come once again for us to do this panel. It's really, Sam?
Slides. Just the slideshow.
Oh. Oh, okay. Great. Good to be here. Good to have the opportunity to share with you. And just, a little bit of the context, I think Adrian and Assia both mentioned this, for our social insurance systems, what's really important is mortality is one of the drivers, just one of the drivers that goes into what the financing of the programs are, which we have to tell our Parliament, our Congress, our elected representatives what they're facing in the future so they will know what kind of changes they're going to have to make if they're going to be able to fully finance these programs into the future. So in that context, when you look at the U.S. Social Security system, what are we really facing? Mortality is a big part of it, but this slide's just intended to give you a little bit of a sense of what the totality of what we're facing is. And this is with respect to the demographics. One of the key things for a system paid for, like most of our social insurance systems, on a pay-as-you-go basis, that is, today's workers are pretty much putting up the money to pay for today's recipients. And the age of dependency ratio is an extremely important indicator, probably more than any other simple indicator that we can put forth. It's just the ratio of the 65 and over population to the working age 20 to 64 population. You can see the black line is what we're facing currently under our projections. And you can see because of the baby boom generation, that is the generation of adults who had lots of children who are now called the baby boomers. And we can see because of the baby boom generation, we were doing well, but post-baby boom, the problem is that we did not have birth rates stay at the 3.3 children per woman level that we had in 1946 through 1965. After that, our birth rates have dropped down more like to 2.0, recently even lower than that. We'll see what's going to happen in the future. Had our birth rate stayed at 3.0 or at 3.3, like in the baby boom period, you see what our age of dependency ratios would look like, which are I guess they're green and purple over here. They look different here, but anyway, they're the two lower lines if we'd maintained higher birth rates. We didn't. So we're facing much higher age dependency ratios. But you can see our challenge for the future is largely just because of the change in the birth rates. Not that mortality doesn't matter, because the increasing age of dependency ratio is in big part because simply of the increasing longevity. But again, just to put it in perspective. So considerations in projecting mortality, we like to look at a lot of things. Variation over time, variation by age, variation by earnings level. We'll get up into that. Changes by causes of death. You've got to understand the components of what's happening in the past in order to understand what the components might be driving things in the future. Cohort considerations for sure. Health spending, obesity, smoking. There is the question, is there a limit on human longevity, the omega? And finally, a little bit look at what our projections are currently. So first of all, a little sort of admonition here about the idea of life expectancy at birth. As you can imagine, where I just indicated that the relative numbers of people, old age versus working age, is what's important. That means that life expectancy at birth per se is not really a very important statistic to look at in this context. It's really what happens at different ages. Moreover, if you look at period life expectancy at birth, it's kind of an interesting pattern, I think. Adrian and Assia both had very similar situations. The thing that we think is interesting in this more than anything else is the fact that females were pulling away from males in terms of increasing life expectancy for quite a while, till about 1970, but it's been kind of shrinking since then. And the widely held belief is that's because men started and kind of stopped pretty much smoking earlier than women did. So women are sort of lagging behind now, but we expect women to start doing better in the future as they also have been pulling away from smoking as men had. So mortality decline varies over time. This is really, really critical. If you're thinking of, I want to put a ruler on some kind of trend and I want to pick what period I want to look at for past trends and to put my ruler on for extrapolation, you've got to really understand what was happening in these different periods of time. You can see we've got for females and for males, the two panels here. We've got for different age groups that we tend to look at under 15 all the way up through the age 85 and older, and then the total. You can see that there's been dramatic variation over time in mortality improvement, starting with 1900. We had periods like 1936 to 1954 that were really, really dramatic, good times of improvement. This is, went into post-World War II. Antibiotics came out, made big, big differences. We also have these sort of goldish, I guess it is, well, whatever it is, the bars that you will be seeing there from 1982 to 1999, that was a bad period, but 1968 to 1982 was a really good period. That's when in the States we had Medicare and Medicaid coming online, and also a lot of increase in the economy and the economic well-being of people. So we had a lot of growth. We also had, by the way, just a little preview of the later side, we have grown over the last 35 or 40 years from 3% of GDP spent on health spending in the U.S. to 18% of GDP. You'd hope you're getting something for that's going to do something about making people healthier, perhaps a little bit less likely to die. Now, this is, the opioids are the big hot topic at the moment. So, and I should mention that, a lot of the work being presented here is due to the great efforts and wonderful talent of one Mark Bai sitting up here in the front row from our office. So we have a fantastic team of folks, and Mark's a really key component of that. Renal pulled a lot of this stuff together. So anything you like here, it's Mark. If you don't like it, that's me. So, so if you see on these bars, again, the female and the male components here, what we've got here are the solid bars, the blue and the gold, show you from 1999 to 2009 for the blue, and from 2009 to 17, the more recent, not so good period, the rate of improvement by age for like all causes. But we also have in these sort of like dashed kind of bars, that's if we simply just exclude the implications of opioids. Now, what's interesting on this is if you look at this, like, for instance, male on the bottom panel, you can see on the solid lines we went from, for ages 15 to 49, a nice healthy improvement rate for the males age 15 to 49 in the earlier period, and in the gold period, not very good at all. We actually had declining mortality rates. Well, if you look at the dashed lines, if we take opioids out of both periods, hey, at least in the later period, we still have a little bit of improvement, but not very much. Key thing is the deceleration from the earlier period, 1999 to 2009, to the later period, 2009 to 17, is very similar. So opioids did have a level effect in terms of the rate of improvement in mortality, but it didn't really affect the deceleration that we had across these two 10-year periods. And you can see that also for the age group age 50 to 64. There's, the differential with and without opioids doesn't really make a lot of difference. We've just had a lot of deceleration in mortality rates, and Mark will probably get this out another time, has done another version of this where it's deaths of despair in general and not just the opioids. But opioids, again, is the hot topic of the day, so we want to really focus on that. So mortality experience, like at all ages, and we like to look rather than life expectancies, we like to look instead something that sort of weights the mortality rates a little bit differently, more in ways that would really focus upon what sort of matters for the projections of the cost of our program. And this is just an age sex-adjusted death rate, total for all ages, and you can see what's happened. And you can see sort of the variation over time of what's happened. In particular, you can see from about 2000 to 2009, I think for some of our other countries, maybe out through 2010 or 11, we had pretty good rate of mortality decline. It was moving nicely. Since 2009, not so good. We've been really pretty level. And of course, the great question of the day is exactly why. Have we run out of gas, or are there bad things going on that we're going to do better on? We see opioids has made a difference, but has it made a whole lot of difference? I would just add everybody's familiar with Case and Deaton. 2.5 years ago, we made a little presentation with Ann Case and Angus Deaton over at the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, up in Boston a couple summers ago. And at the end of it, we raised the question to Case and Deaton, so what do you think of our projections? And Angus Deaton didn't hold back from it. He says, you're projecting too much mortality improvement. You're being too optimistic. So anyway, well, with that said, you can see, well, maybe he was right. look at the little more colorful lines here of what we were projecting in terms of mortality improvement in the recent trustees reports, 2017, 18, and 19, and what's actually happened. So we've been over-projecting mortality improvement for a while now. We didn't put what all the reports were before that. You'd see similar for at least 2 or 3 years before that. Now for ages 65 and older, which really is, Assia, I think, sort of mentioned is for our retirement programs, that's really the more important thing to look at. Very similar pattern, except the extreme nature of the deceleration after 2009 is even more apparent for the age 65 and older. Had relatively little improvement since 2009, and again, we've been over-projecting mortality improvement at these ages for the last several years, so we're hardly in a position if we're not projecting enough mortality improvement, at least over the last several years. Now, variation by age is really, really a big deal, and this again speaks back to the idea of looking at a singular statistic, whether it's age sex-adjusted mortality rate decline, all ages included, or life expectancy at birth. The rate of improvement in mortality by age really, really matters, and you can see historically this is something we've worked on with actuaries from UK and Canada over the years, and this is a little bit out of date. This only goes through 2009, but you can see 0 to 14, all 3 countries have had very, very strong rates of improvement in mortality, going back to like 1929 to 2009 over a long period, and much less as we go to higher and higher ages. Not a real surprise that we probably put more emphasis on and more ability to lower death rates at younger ages. And at higher ages, I think several people at the conference have already said, someday we're all going to die. So knocking down death rates dramatically at age 85 and older is probably a little bit harder. We haven't done so well in the past. And the question is, what is this age gradient going to look like in the future? We'll get to that a little bit later on, but another thing that we've talked a lot about here in the conference is what is happening in terms of by income status, or in this case, what we like to look at, because it's germane really to our program and the level of benefits, your lifetime career earnings levels for people who have worked enough to become insured to receive a retired worker benefit. Those are the people for whom we can really decipher, based on their benefit level, what kind of average earnings levels they've had over their career. If you look at the right panel for the males, you can see that we had some separation here. These are for males at 65 to 9, looking at their relative mortality rates at that age group, 65 to 9, based on their career average earnings levels. And you can see from 2000 to about 2005 or 10, there was some increasing separation, but more recently it appears like this has stabilized and maybe even come back some. So we're not really too concerned about increasing differentiation, but we're going to be paying attention to this. We have some more data coming up here in the not too distant future, a little tease, so we'll see how that is going. But bottom line is we're not seeing a dramatic kind of differentiation increasing from what we've had recently. Mortality decline by cause of death. This is, other than looking at it by age, which is extremely important, we will look at mortality decline by cause of death. And you can see on this slide that at least over age 50, the improvement, as I think most other presentations here at the conference so far have indicated, has really been coming from what? It's been coming from cardiovascular. That's where we've had all the improvement over this period we have from 1979 to 2017, largely because that's a period for which we have the best and most consistent data from our Centers for Disease Control on mortality by age and by cause. And you can see a number of the other causes, like the dark blue line on the right at ages 50 and over has not been so good. They've been mortality increases for what we call the all other category, which is dominated by a number of things, including, for instance, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, et cetera. Something that we don't have split out at this point, but we're thinking about it because that would probably be useful for the future. Now, as to this thing about heart disease, this is a slide, just, we have to tell you, we didn't even do the slide. This is done by a good friend, Bob Anderson over at NCHS. He presented this a couple of years ago, and this just sort of puts a sharp point on the idea that heart disease has really been a big thing up through 1950. Heart disease deaths were really rising a lot, and since 1950 they've been dropping very, very dramatically. And one of the questions is, since 1950, if we've had this dramatic drop in heart disease, cancer finally made a turnaround as we expected. Stroke has been going down for quite a while. Without the possibility of a continuing drop in heart disease to the extent we've had in the past, should we be expecting that overall mortality will be dropping like it has over this period? I mean, heart disease is basically running out of gas. So you really have to look at by cause and see what's available for us to make changes in the future. So developing assumptions by cause, We use what we'd like to describe as a scientific approach. We talk to people in the medical community, National Centers of Health Statistics, National Institutes of Health, and others. And a little bit more recently, we had some consultation with some folks at Johns Hopkins University. They're medical clinicians and researchers who really have their hands on this stuff and not just statistical extrapolators like we all are, but we want to actually be informed by people who are really, who are really in the game. And what we have here is something I won't spend a lot of detailed time on this because is that 5 minutes up here or is that not quite yet? Oh, 7. Okay, great. Still got a couple of minutes. So on the you can see this is cardiovascular. This is what we have projected out into 2038 to 2088, the dark lines, and also for the period 2010 to 2038, which is sort of over the next 30 years or so. And we have in the little box what the Johns Hopkins clinicians and researchers totally independent estimates were of what's going to happen over that period. And it turns out that, if anything, they're a little bit less optimistic than we are on future cardiovascular. So, well, we're thinking about it. On the respiratory, the Hopkins experts were a little more optimistic under age 50 and a little less optimistic over age 85 for mortality improvement in the future for respiratory. For cancer, very similar to what our expectations are. And I should, as you can see here, it says the trustees' expectations on these slides. Unlike Assia's situation, we are not in a position where the Office of the Actuary absolutely reigns supreme and controls all of the assumptions, lock, stock, and barrel. They are, by law, intended to be reports from our Board of Trustees. They have the final say about assumptions. However, we have the final say of the final say. The last page of the trustees' report is a place where there has to be an actuarial opinion by the chief actuary as to the reasonableness of all the assumptions. So they can't veer too far off of the right place, as we would deem it to be, lest we would go after them in the actuarial opinion. So cohort considerations. Don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but we look at cohort considerations, but as we've seen in a number of places, you've got to really think if you've seen just, for example, a cohort that up to an age 40, 50, 60 has been doing really well compared to the prior cohort, before you extrapolate that they're going to continue to do better than the prior cohort in terms of the death rates at higher ages, you've got to step back once again and think about the conditions. Think about why are they doing better. If it's because you've had interventions that have been keeping really severely impaired people alive longer that lower the death rates, that's good, but that will mean at higher ages that cohort is going to be a more impaired group than they would have been had you not extended. So therefore you may not expect to have the kind of mortality improvements relative to prior cohorts. It could even go the other way. If on the other hand your interventions have simply made this group of people healthier, better diet, better exercise, well, not so much in the States, but if that were the case, then you would expect the improvements to sort of persist onto higher ages. That would be good. Future conditions changing. I mentioned a little bit about smoking. Smoking, we expect a little bit more improvement from smoking. Obesity, however, and sedentary lifestyle, that is clearly an issue. Health spending, human limits. So let's go to this. Obesity, this is a slide that Sam Preston presented to us back in 2011. It was kind of like an eye-opening slide because he presented this slide. This is the rate of obesity in the United States by age group. And what you'll see right away is, wow, obesity was increasing for all ages at the same time. This is like a period kind of effect, not a generational effect. But he presented this and said we're kind of flummoxed a little bit in the academic community because with a big increase in obesity at higher ages, we're not seeing a commensurate increase in longevity. So then we raise the question, well, the people who are, because this is booming all ages up at the time, the people who are more recently at higher ages, more obese, they haven't been obese throughout their whole life. Because if you look at them on a cohort basis, they were lower than will be in the future. So with the higher rates of obesity at all ages now, in another 20, 30 years, we're going to have people entering old age who've been obese for a much longer period of time. Sam concluded, just like smoking, there are probably cumulative effects to being obese for a long time, as opposed to just getting there when you're 60. He's done some work on that, and he basically has estimated that the improvement we might yet expect to have from the improvement in smoking is going to be at least maybe more than offset by obesity. Last little thing, let me just share you here, which is on health spending. Health spending, as I mentioned before, we went from 3 to 18% of GDP. You cannot continue that rate of increase in the share of GDP unless we have nothing but GDP. And you can see here a little metric that we've shown based on the law and what we have for the future for Medicare spending. Medicare spending per enrollee, how that looks compared to the rate of growth in GDP or output per worker. And you can see from 1970 to 2010, we had from like 3 to 5% faster growth in Medicare spending per enrollee than we had for output per worker. Again, that's not the kind of thing you can continue forever, especially with increasing dependency ratios. In the future, under current law, we're projecting that to be basically flat. That may be what deceleration looks like in terms of what we're spending on increased health, and therefore we might expect to have some deceleration of mortality rates. And the absolute final thing is there an omega? We've seen something like this. This is just the wonderful old survival curve that we've been moving more towards rectangularization, but what you'll see across all these periods, we're getting more and more towards rectangularization, which maybe the average life expectancy will approach our omega. That would be fine, but the omega itself is not getting much above 100, and what are the prospects for really having a substantial portion of our population really getting up to that kind of level? So this is just, age gradient, all the other factors already mentioned to follow, and this just shows the actual rates of improvement that we are assuming. And I just want to sort of point you to the bottom right portion of this. We do not assume rate of improvement in mortality at all ages the same or even near it. We maintain an age gradient in the future. It is compressed from what we've had quite a bit in the past, but we are assuming that there will continue to be some age gradient, not nearly as much as what happened in the Lee and Carter method, where the past age gradient would be extrapolated exactly. And I won't even show you what these. This is just the age, sex adjusted death rate, all ages, and you can see on a log scale we're actually not far from just being linear into the future. And the very final thing, the coup de grace, is it's all about the age distribution of the population. And you can follow through these periods and see in the future we're just going to move from a larger portion of our adult population being over 65, a larger portion being over 85 also. But this is really the challenge. And again, as the first slide in the deck showed, it's largely fertility that's driving this. Mortality is not insignificant, so we have to pay attention to both. So thank you.
Thanks to all three presenters. We have a couple minutes. We started a couple minutes late, so we have a little bit more time on Q&A. So please line up or at the mic and state your name before you make a comment or a question. Les.
Thanks, Les Lohman. For each of the speakers, especially Assia and Steve, I noticed on the future drivers of mortality, at least I didn't notice, but I don't pay attention all that well anyway. But I didn't see anything about toxicity in the environment. And, Steve was talking a lot about obesity, so did Assia. And there are some theories out there that a lot of the obesity is from toxicities in the environment destroying, gut bacteria. Say that 10 times fast. And one of my favorite issues is glyphosate, Roundup, which Canada uses a ton of it with wheat and oats. The U.S. uses a lot as well. It's in the water supply. They've discovered it in the placenta of pregnant women. It's extraordinarily destructive to the intestinal tract of humans, and therefore affecting a lot of these things. I'm surprised not to see that something as important as that. And of course, the U.S. has a ton of aluminum in the soil, which is also not so good for food. It would be good to see that as part of the analysis. So you can say something about it, but if you just want to listen, that's fine.
Oh, works. Not much to say. I would just say that there are so many factors going on in terms of the one thing I would share about obesity is at lunch, Rob Brown was mentioning that last night he went to a steak place and they walked a whole steer in. Well, not quite, but it was a hunk of meat, way more than he could possibly eat. So I think portion control would be a big thing in the United States, whether it's changing chemistry in our gut, as you say, is the biggest thing. I think there are a lot of factors.
Great.
For me, it's definitely one of consideration. We do not quantify it, but the same, we do not quantify the future impact of climate changes, for example, on the life expectancy. If anything, Canada may expect to be a winner. Not that we'll be very happy about that. But there are a lot of factors, a lot of unknown, and we, as I said, we do not project by particular factors, but I think we do recognize that there will be some positive and negative factors that will affect future mortality.
Christine Dunnigan from the Office of the Chief Actuary. I have two questions. The first one is I'd like to know what Japan is doing right. What's their secret compared to the other countries? So if there's some insight on that, is it dietary, lifestyle, support system through family? If there's other considerations. My other question is with regards to the decrease in heart diseases. Is it mainly due to advances in medical and access to medication, new medication that has decreased these rates? And is there any consideration, this is more for Steve, of increasing those rates because of obesity and the fact that the people are, when they enter retirement, have been obese over their more obese over more years prior to retirement?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, what you're suggesting really is obesity and other factors. Where is that really going to play out? In terms of, we tend to think of that as being diabetes and some other areas. Could it be cardiovascular as well? But I think really both what you're pointing out and what Les has said should give us all pause that there are lots of things potentially on the downside that could be affecting us in the future. We've tended not to. I would say that in our projections, I don't know whether this would be true for the UK and Canada also. We have not gone greatly into the direction of saying either we're going to have massive droughts and terrible things, and therefore we're going to have tremendous increases in mortality, nor have we gone in the direction of saying we're anticipating major breakthroughs, like for instance, for diseases of the brain, similar to what we were wonderfully able to do, rather more straightforwardly, I would suggest, on heart disease. So there is a lot of room for possible variation here. I'm hoping we have, kind of like a nice middle on this.
I do agree with Steve, basically, yes. About Japan, I don't know. The only thing I should say that it's really true for Japanese women. It's not so true for men, because if you look at the mortality rates 1994 for men, and sorry, I didn't check for latest years, but about 2-3 years ago, the mortality rates in Japan were higher than the mortality rates in Canada for males in this age group. I don't know.
Yes, and just to say, when we ask our expert panel, we do ask them about things like what their opinion about the effects of obesity, climate change and that kind of thing, what they think will have on life expectancy, whether it would carry on going up at the same rate or whether it would be a negative effects and so on. So though it's kind of not quantified as saying it would be X less and so on, we do ask them for their opinions. And if they came up with something that said, yes, we think this is going to have a very big impact in the future, it's something that we hopefully would research into.
And if I could just add, in Japan, I know that we've heard a lot in the past that Japan has maintained a lot more intergenerational, multi-generational family living, which may have positive effects, more caretakers immediately there, perhaps smaller family sizes. There's also been some question, I don't know, Sam, whether you've looked into this, some suggestion a while back, maybe this has been clarified, that there was some sort of misstatement of age more than in most places in Japan, and that could have been contributing towards some of the increasing longevity that had been measured.
I don't think that much for females, where the Japan has a more significant advantage. But I think their significant advantage is with respect to cardiovascular, and there's a number of reasons for that. But we don't have too much time to elaborate. So the last two questions.
Doug Andrews, University of Waterloo. Question for Adrian. You've been working on quantifying the impacts of inequality and also deprivation on mortality. Of course, the big thing that's coming to the UK is Brexit, which may bring more of both of those things. What work have you been doing on the impact of Brexit?
Probably, yeah, the answer is no, because we didn't quite know whether we'd be leaving or not. So now that we know that, well, we are leaving at the end of January, but we'll still be quite a long time before we actually leave or something. So I think we get around this past, the ONS would be saying that these are projections, they're not forecasts, and also we don't know the impact of Brexit yet because it's only just happening, and you could model a scenario, and we can certainly, in terms of the projections, we may say things like migration, that we could all do a projection with a different migration on an assumption, but at the moment, we're not kind of allowing anything to predict. There are no Brexit projections. And there are no projections for if Scotland go independent as well.
Stephen Baxter, Club Vita, and I think this is probably a question more for Adrian and Steve with your trustee panels and expert panels that you can call upon. With hindsight, looking back a number of decades ago when we first observed smoking cessation, we probably could have reflected that sooner into some of the projection models we had. So the question for yourselves is, what things are your panels saying are happening now that are likely to have very dramatic future impacts, but which we haven't yet seen any discernible sign of in the observational data? Thank you.
Well, I guess I just mention this at an earlier breakout session, that when we look back at the last time our mortality projections mattered really a lot was our 1982 projections that were used for developing the 1983 amendments, the last big amendments for U.S. Social Security, where the normal retirement age was, for the only time enacted a change, was enacted then. And as it turns out, our projections for life expectancy, males and females combined, at age 65, which again is the most germane, the accuracy of our projection back in 1982 for, say, 2010 was actually right on. And for after 2010, since we've not had very good experience since 2010, if anything, our projections back then were for more mortality improvement than we've actually had. So we're feeling, pretty good in that regard in terms of the actuarial projections. The one thing I would mention is we do have, every 4 years, we have a technical panel of outside experts come in and speak. They have been very, very consistent on the 1% train. Now we've heard 0.8, 1.2. There's a whole different ranges of where you think ultimate mortality might improve at. Our technical panels have, for the last 3 or 4 panels, all said ultimately 1%. It's a nice round number. We're thinking a little bit less than that, obviously, based on looking at cost specific. But lately it's been sort of 1.0 is what they're all saying.
So trying to think of what we're asking the expert panel. I think we do have a question on there about where they can raise subjects which you think might be important in the future. I think it's difficult to actually do that now and to guess what would be happening immediately. It'd be more long term, but obviously things are happening in the UK, things like climate change and effects of pollution, that's risen up to the higher up in the agenda, what effect they may have, and they may have a relatively quick effect on mortality.
Any last thoughts, comments?
Just offer one other thing, whether it be climate change or other things. There is another aspect of this, and that is, as per the mention before of the Affordable Care Act in the United States and the effect it might have on health spending in the future. If in fact we did have something that was really severe in terms of climate change, it took away arable land, it made it more difficult to grow crops, it had really severe economic impacts, that could then further diminish the amount of GDP we'll have to be able to spend on health improvements. So there are those kinds of risks, but again, these are hopefully risks that we keep in mind, but we don't necessarily put a price tag on just at this moment.
With that, please join with me to thank the panel members who really gave us a lot.